Alright folks, so today we are going to talk about reproductive behavior with the focus on behavior. I think most of you at this point in your lives understand sort of the tab A slot B business. If you don't, there's a YouTube video for that, I'm certain. You can look that up. We're not too interested in that. In this class we'll cover a few things as we need to, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Is that better? Just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're going to chat about today. Okay, but we're going to focus more on the behavioral aspects. How, again, always thinking about how biology drives behavior. We're going to talk about interesting examples with people. We're going to focus a lot of our chats today on rats and mice. There's been a lot of rodent work. Sort of in this field. We will even have a nice chat about gorillas and bonobos and orangutans. That's going to be thrilling, so hang in there for that. If you thought you were going to leave early, don't. It's going to be a fun one. And then we might even have a nice Halloween-themed story about sheep. It'll be exciting. Alright, we will talk a little bit about sexual development, hormonal control, neural control. We'll briefly touch on sexual orientation and then talk about parental behavior. Now, I do want to be clear for this particular class. How many of you have taken the Dr. Mueller-Liley's human sexual behavior? Is that the name of that class?
I think so.
Something like that.
I went that with Dr. Atkins, but she's still doing it forever ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so if you had that class, obviously they covered a lot of things that we're not going to cover in this class, right? Because that was a very broad class, or that covered a lot of things in depth, and it was all about sex, right? You're getting one chapter of that sort of here in this class, and we're going to really focus on sort of hormonal drives and other things. So there are a ton of things we're going to skip over. Not that they're not important, but we just don't have time for them because this class focuses on many other things. If you're interested in human sexual behavior, I recommend that class. I think it's a good class. Most students have positive reviews about it. So there you go. All right. So why is reproductive behavior so important? Well, guess what? None of you would be here without reproductive behavior, right? So this is the time in your life when you have to start thinking about your parents having sex. I know that happened. You just like to ignore that part, right? I probably shouldn't say that. I was going to say probably with you guys out of the house, they're doing it right now. But nobody wants to think about that. So, reproductive behavior, it's a social behavior, right? Because it involves more than one person, at least for what we're going to talk about, right? And without reproductive behavior, most species would not survive. There are a few odd species that can reproduce asexually, right? They just like pinch off a clump and grow an exact copy of themselves. But those are not things we're interested in here. Alright, so we do want to think about just a few things. Again, make sure we're all on the same page. There is sexually dimorphic behavior. I want to introduce this idea of sexual dimorphism right now. That just means males and females are different morphologically, right? We'll talk about some brain differences. There's some physical differences between males and females. I think most of you know what those are. That's what we mean by dimorphic, right? So we're thinking about two different sort of body types and even behaviors when it comes to sexual behavior. So we'll talk about that. Sexual dimorphism is going to play an interesting role later. I'm going to tell you why you're only allowed to marry one person at a time. Right now you think it's like a legal reason. Like, do you ever think about this? Like, why can I only marry one person at a time? If I could find two other people that wanted to marry me, and they were consenting adults, right, obviously, so that's a given. Why shouldn't I be able to do that? Right? Nobody's ever thought about that? Nobody's ever been able to think that they could get two other people to like them that much at the same time, right, Caroline? I mean, that's just, right, I mean, that's baffling, right? Well, I'm going to tell you why, sort of biologically, it's typically a one-to-one pair in humans. That's not the same in other species. We'll chat about that. If we talk about gametes, we're talking about sperm and ova, or eggs, right? So we're thinking about male and female sex cells. The sex chromosomes are the X and the Ys, right? Everybody gets one X, typically. Now, there are instances where people get more than one X. We're not going to talk about those. We're going to skip past that, right? Some folks have poly-X. It's a different situation. But if you have 0 X's, guess what happens? You don't exist, right? There's important stuff on the X. Now, a number of you get 2 X's. That's awesome, right? If you get one that's a little screwed up, you can use the other one, right? So that happens. This happens a lot for like color blindness, right? The gene for color blindness is on the X chromosome, so if you have two X chromosomes and one of them says, hey, you're going to be colorblind, you can actually use the other X chromosome and not be colorblind. That's awesome. There are some of you that only have one X chromosome and you ended up with a Y in the other slot, right? If you get a screwed up X chromosome there, you have to use the one you have. This is why we see a higher percentage of males as colorblind than females, because they have to use that X chromosome one way or the other. There are really only about 2 important things on the Y chromosome. It's actually the smallest chromosome that you have of the 23 chromosomes. I typically say all that's on there is like chest hair and testicles. There's nothing else really on the Y chromosome of much importance. Okay. The only other thing there is what we call these junk repeats. These are great for paternity tests, right? Because the Y chromosome, if you have a Y chromosome, the one you have is identical to the one that your father had, which is identical to the one that his father had, right? And so you can go back, sort of for our purposes, indefinitely, through the male line and do paternity tests that way. Now, the question that's really a puzzler is, what about brothers that have the same father? They have the same Y chromosome, right? So then you'll never know. So you can have fun with that. Should I go ahead and tell them, like, probably up to 25% of them don't know who their father is? I don't know, right? We'll talk about extra pair copulations later. Here you go. Here's the XY breakdown. You guys have a handle on this. We should talk about gonads briefly. I love that they give you that phonetic pronunciation there. That's from your book publisher. I don't know. I don't know what they're thinking sometimes. If we talk about gonads, we're thinking ovaries and testes, right? What we do want to think about is the difference between an organizational effect and an activational effect, and both of these are talking about hormones, okay? And this is going to be an important theme that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about hormones over the next couple weeks and the influence of hormones on your behavior, right? When we think about organizational effects, we're really thinking about early development. Most of this is going on while you're a fetus, right? While you're still cooking in a uterus. You're going to be exposed to various hormones. If you're exposed to the right combination of hormones, you will sort of wither away the female reproductive system and develop a male reproductive system. If you're not exposed to those hormones, then the female reproductive system will continue to develop. If you are an XX and you're supposed to normally develop that female reproductive system, that's great. If you're an XY and there's a problem with the hormonal sort of situation, or if you're an XX and there's a problem with the hormonal situation, you get exposed to some androgens, you can end up with ambiguous genitalia, right? We're not going to talk a whole lot about that, but just be aware that's out there. So we've got our organizational effects. Again, that's early development. Activational effects is turning things on at a later time, right? You don't have to answer this because I already know the answer, but how many of you have been through puberty? All of you, right? I know this. And if you haven't, then you know someone who has, right? So you just ask a friend. That's what we're thinking about with activational effects. Most everyone is born with a reproductive system, male or female. You know, that was created during that early development time based on that hormonal combination we'll talk about in a moment. you don't really do much with that for a number of years, right? It's just kind of there, you've got it, it's not really doing anything, and then all of a sudden around puberty, that system gets kicked on, and you've got to try to figure out how to use that thing appropriately, right? So there you go. If you've not hit puberty yet, watch out for it. It's coming and it's a lot of fun. Nobody's excited about that. If we think about internal sex organs, mostly we're thinking about some of the tubes and ducts and things, ovaries and testes, right? The Mullerian system is going to be in females. The Wolffian system is in males. You need a couple hormones to prevent the development of the Mullerian system and drive that Wolffian system. One is going to be the anti-Mullerian hormone, which has what we call a defeminizing effect, right? So the anti-Mullerian hormone is going to prevent the development of the female reproductive system. If you're exposed to androgens, primarily the guy we want to think about is testosterone. And then testosterone has some derivatives as well, so we can think about those. But that's actually going to have what we call a masculinizing effect. So that will drive the development of that Wolffian system. So you got to cause one system to wither away so you can develop the other system. There is a situation called androgen insensitivity syndrome. We just talked about this a little bit. These are folks who have testosterone, but they don't have any receptors. Just put a big X there on the receptors. Okay, so testosterone's floating around. They've got an X and a Y, but they don't have anywhere for that testosterone to dock and do anything with it, right? So these individuals will not develop typical male sexual characteristics. There are the external genitalia. I think most of you know what those are. We'll talk a little bit about them as we need to. I think any of this is terribly important, but if you need to go back and review it, you're welcome to. This is kind of interesting, a nice flow chart. I know you guys love flow charts, right? You guys probably have flow charts tattooed all over your bodies. Nobody gets a good flow chart tattoo these days. You should think about it. This is the XY male situation. Notice we have to have the presence of those androgens and that anti-Mullerian hormone to drive the development of the male reproductive system and cause the female reproductive system to wither away. In the XX female situation, no hormones are present, and the Mullerian system develops on its own, and the Wolffian system without the androgens will wither away. Okay? Kind of the default status is female, right? Which is awesome. If you want to, especially in humans, let's say your goal was to increase population, the best way to do that is probably by having more females, right? So if you wanted, let's do some math. Who loves math? Nobody. How often can you have a child as a human adult? Like realistically, like once a year, right? I mean, that's a pretty good, because it takes like 9 months to cook one of those things, and then you got to feed it for, right? So let's just say you could do that once a year. And so like once a year you can have a child. Okay. Well, how many years can you have a child, right? So that's the next question. Like, what are your childbearing years? And it's basically from puberty to menopause, right? And even if you hit puberty, let's just take a number 13, right? And then when do you think you're going to hit menopause? 45? That's a number, right? At most, you're going to get maybe 30 years of 30 years when you could, shoot out an infant, right? So you're only going to be able to have an opportunity to create 30 half copies of yourself, right, as a female. A male, on the other hand, doesn't have that sort of limitation biologically, because they're not required to like cook that human for a number of months, and they're not required to feed that human for a few months after that, right? And so the male can actually reproduce at a much higher rate than that, provided females are available. So it makes sense biologically to have more females than it does males. If you get a situation where you're getting too many males, you'll actually start to see a decrease in population. Nobody thought that was interesting. population control through CRISPR. You think about that? You guys know about CRISPR? So you guys can have CRISPR babies. That doesn't mean you put your baby in the refrigerator or fry them. That would make them crispy. Sydney thought that was funny. Maybe Sydney's a Jonathan Swift fan. What was that? What was that satire he wrote called "The Indecent Solution"? Or It involved eating babies. It did involve eating babies, and that's why I remember that. I wanted to say it was "The Indecent Proposal," but I think that was something else. Yeah, but it also sounds like something else. It was something proposal. Anyway, back in the 1600s, you guys know Gulliver's Travels, right? So the guy who wrote that said, hey, we should start eating babies because we've got too many people. And babies are annoying. I think he said that as well. You're going to look this up? Yeah, because it's a good one. So, while we're figuring out whether or not we should eat babies, the point of that was it's gene editing, right? A modest proposal. Yeah, it was modest, right? It wasn't indecent. Gene editing. With gene editing, you could, and CRISPR, you could actually influence the genetic makeup of your child. That'd be awesome, right? Except up until the point that it's not. And there's some ethical issues there. Anybody see the movie Gattaca? Good movie? Who said that? You're like the one person who's ever seen that movie when I mentioned it. Really? It actually is a decent movie, right? So, had some phenomenal folks in it. I don't know, anybody a Jude Law fan? Who's not a Jude Law fan, right? Like everybody probably, but Jude Law's in it. Ethan Hawke, who doesn't do a whole lot of work these days. And Uma Thurman. None of those people do much work, right? So this movie was made in the 90s when they were all really busy. But it's about gene editing and so forth. And genetically enhanced folks and people who aren't. I don't know. You guys can think about that if you want. It's totally up to you. But I would recommend watching that movie, right? It's a pretty good film. You can probably get it on Netflix or Hulu or, hey, better yet, try the library. They have free movies there. And did you know while you're on campus you actually have access to HBO? Yeah. You didn't know that? I know, right? So they don't tell some people these things.
Well, to sign into their Wi-Fi, it's like some weird, you have to download an app.
Oh.
I haven't done it because I just don't want to.
They'll control your phone and they'll make you go crazy. I saw that movie with Samuel L. Jackson. Colin Firth was in it. What was it, The Kingsman? When he sent that cell phone signal and everybody went crazy in the church. Cinematography was actually pretty nice on that. We've got hormones. We got a lot of hormones. And a lot of these hormones go in the same direction. So why do we need, in this particular case, we're going to have something called the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. That's coming out of your hypothalamus, headed over to your pituitary gland. It's going to tell it's going to make you release gonadotropic hormone, and your gonadotropic hormone is then going to go, depending on what you've got, ovaries or testes, it's going to go there and make you dump out testosterone or estrogens. It's like a three-step process, right? Why with hormones do we have this three-step process? Why isn't it just fast like action potentials? How many of you would have loved to have had puberty as quick as an action potential? 2 milliseconds and you're done. All of a sudden, all the parts you had that needed to grow were grown. All the places you were going to sprout hair were already full and bushy, and you're just ready to roll. Voice is done, doing whatever quacking it's going to do, and you're ready to roll. Pimples are gone. You had them there for 2 milliseconds, all at once, giant eruption, and then you're done. Right? Sounds brilliant. Doesn't work that way. Puberty lasts for what? 4, 5, 6 decades? No, puberty lasts for a while, right? It's not a short. I mean, it is kind of short if you live long enough, but when you're in the middle of it, you think it's a really long process, right? And it is. But hormones are slower and longer acting, right? So anything in the endocrine system is going to take longer than the nervous system would take, right? And the reason for this is, for example, puberty. Think about what happened to you during puberty. You don't have to answer this, but how many of you grew something during puberty? Right? Like everybody did. A lot of people grew taller. Most everybody grew some hair in a few new places, right? That happened. That's a very energy rich activity, right? So you have to dump a lot of resources into that. And you don't want to do that sort of instantaneously. It takes some time. And you want to make sure that you're turning it on at the right time because it's so costly to go into puberty. You don't want to do it at the wrong time, right? You want to have this set up and you want to do that properly. We're going to talk in a moment about why we're starting to see puberty, the onset of puberty just a little bit earlier, right, now than what we've seen in the past. It's kind of interesting. There are several reasons for that. There's this guy called kisspeptin. Kisspeptin is a hormone that initiates puberty. Anybody know why it's called kisspeptin? It was this. Go ahead.
It was discovered in that part of Pennsylvania where they make the Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. It was at the campus there in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So kisspeptin. It has nothing to do with like kissing other people, although some people start to do more of that during puberty as well. But you have to watch out for that. Like that's the time you're going to pick up like cold sores. So you're just like randomly sampling other people's lips. So you have to watch out for those. Now everybody's doing this, trying to hide if they think they have a cold sore. Kisspeptin initiates puberty. Interestingly, it's under the control of this guy called leptin, right? And leptin actually comes from adipose tissue. So what you'll actually see is, particularly this is true in females, in young female humans who have a lower body fat percentage, they'll actually go into puberty later, and then females that have a higher body fat percentage. And that's because of the presence of leptin and the amount of leptin that you have. And this makes a lot of sense, right? What's one indicator that you have the metabolic resources to actually go into puberty? Well, if you have a higher percentage of energy stored in your body, then your body's probably able and capable to take that energy and use that to go into puberty. So you're going to have more leptin, which is going to tell kisspeptin to get puberty started, right? If you're kind of short on the leptin, then you probably don't have the energy resources necessary. You're going to try to hold off on going into puberty until you absolutely need to. So there you go. That's kind of interesting, right? So we've seen a sort of a reduction in the age of onset for puberty, and that's a lot of that's going to be dietary, because we have better diets, we have more access to food. You know, kids are eating more now, and hopefully eating healthier now, so they're able to undertake these sort of big body changes at earlier times because they have that energy ready. It's kind of interesting, right? So there you go. Questions about that? We'll actually talk about leptin a good bit more when we talk about ingestive behavior. All right, here we go. This is what we just talked about. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropic hormone coming out of the pituitary gland, and then you get testosterone or estradiol, for example, coming out of your testes or ovaries. Not a big deal. Then these guys go out and they make things happen, right? I guess I should say, how many of you have testosterone in your bodies right now? That's like everybody, right? So everybody has testosterone, everybody has some estrogens. It's about the ratio of that, right, and that balance, right? Some of you have more testosterone than you have estrogens. A quick way to tell is to rub your face. If you can feel some hair, you've probably got more testosterone, right? If you don't feel any hair, then you might have more estrogen, right? That's always a good sort of test there, right? Facial hair is a quick and easy one, because that's a good secondary male characteristic, right? This is why sometimes when folks go into menopause, and when I say folks, I mean the female folks, right? Male folks don't go into menopause. When you go into menopause, that's why you might start to see, some small hair growth in some places, because your ovaries have decided they're retiring, and so you're no longer getting hormones from there. You're only going to get hormones out of your adrenal glands, which those guys produce androgens, right? And so that's all you have left. So your ratio sort of shifts, and you see, some changes there. Not a big deal. Happens to everybody. Just watch out for it. This is also the reason why If you rubbed your face and you felt like sandpaper, you're not going to have to worry about osteoporosis, right? Testosterone, for example, is required for bone growth. That's why males typically don't get osteoporosis, but females will. I mean, males will eventually get osteoporosis, but you have to live to be like 150, right? And then there's some like racial and ethnic risk factors as well with osteoporosis. So if you're in that category, have them like zap you through the heel, and they'll test your bone density, and you can figure out if it's an issue or not. Wouldn't waste my time if you shave your face every day. Probably don't need a bone density scan. There you go, some androgens. Again, mostly we're thinking testosterone. There's also dihydrotestosterone, but again, that's a derivative of testosterone. You get your maturation of your male external genitalia. Also causes in women and men as well, pubic and axillary. Most of you know where the pubic hair is. Axillary hair is in your armpits, right? In case you wanted to know where that was. And there you go. We'll talk a little bit about sex drive and testosterone in men and women later. It's kind of an interesting story. It's kind of fun. Females, we already talked about estradiol, for example, those estrogens. Again, female genitalia, changes in some of the fat deposits in women. Men and women have sort of stereotypical fat deposits, right, where you can find those. They're different in men and women. There's actually something interesting if you, sometimes for females when they start to have problems, if they have problems with their ovaries and they stop producing as much of the estrogen, they'll actually start to get more fat deposits on their stomachs, right, which is typical for males, right? It's kind of where males get their fat deposits. That's why you see the sort of the middle-aged paunch, right, in males, because testosterone decides to hang the fat on the front for men. Kind of interesting. We'll also talk about estrogens later and the menstrual cycle. I'm assuming most of you know about the menstrual cycle, right? If you're not, if you've not been through one yourself, you know someone who has, right? That's how that works, right? Everybody's got a mom, so assuming she went through at least one menstrual cycle, that's how you got here. You're actually up until, well, between puberty and menopause, you're always going through your menstrual cycle, right? So it's not like I'm on my menstrual cycle now. Well, that's, you always are, right? That's like saying I'm breathing now. You might be breathing in or you might be breathing out, but you're still breathing. So you've always got things going on there. If you're not a human, please raise your hand. Well, there's a special enrollment form you have to fill out. If you're not a human, we call that an estrous cycle. It's the same thing, right? If you're a rat, you've got an estrous cycle. If you're a human, you've got a menstrual cycle. There are some minor differences, but the goal's the same, right? The end result is to put an egg in your uterus for a few days, see if it gets fertilized. If it doesn't, dump it out, right? You don't want to leave that out there for very long. They can expire, okay? So you leave it out there for a few days. If it gets fertilized, then you maybe try to grow something based on that. If not, dump it out and start over again in a few weeks, right? Same thing if you're a rat, same thing if you're a monkey, same thing if you're a dog, right? They all go through these cycles, right? And they go through them all the time. It's not a big deal. There are some interesting differences, though, in humans and non-human animals. One of those is, so please don't raise your hand, because I really don't want to know. But how many of you know if you, or let's just imagine, like if you're a male, like a significant female in your life, how many of you know if you or that other person is fertile right now? Like if they actually have an egg in their uterus. Like think about it for a moment and see if you can figure it out. Yeah, that's one thing you can do. I wouldn't recommend that because I have some other options for you. Because there are much safer ways to not get pregnant, and there are much funner ways to get pregnant. Than like continuing to just take your temperature, right? My suggestion is if you don't want to get pregnant, don't rely on body temperature, because body temperatures do fluctuate, right? Try other methods. There are hormonal and non-hormonal methods that still let you have fun, And I would highly recommend those that are safe for you in your particular life circumstances. You know, they'll stick stuff in your arm, they'll stick stuff in your uterus, they'll stick stuff in your purse that you take every day. Any of those work, okay? And some are hormonal and some are not. Most of you are probably safe still taking hormonal birth control. In another decade or two, you might not want to, right? Because you have to worry about like stroke issues and other problems as you get older. So keep that in mind. Temperature, right? So I'll finish my temperature story. If you're trying to get pregnant, instead of taking your temperature every day, there's like one other thing you could do every day, right? As well, that would also increase the likelihood that you would get pregnant. Right? So I think if it was me, that's the one I would opt for, because it's a whole lot more fun. I've taken temperatures. It's not that thrilling. So there are other things you can do. Just keep that in mind. But menstrual cycles, right? So most of the time, like overtly, you don't know this, right? Like just looking at someone, you can't go, yep, there's an egg in that uterus. You have no idea. You have no idea, right? But for example, in chimpanzees, there's a very easy way to tell if there's an egg in a chimpanzee's uterus. Their genitals will be bright red. Bright red. I mean, just like a big flashing sign, right? Doesn't happen in humans. There's an easy way to determine this. You know, you can check every day, right? It's not going to happen. Nothing's going to turn. If something turns bright red down there in a human, you need to go see your doctor, right? Because you got a problem. You need to get that fixed. But in other species, they have some very obvious signs. Fertility, right? There's an egg ready, and that lets the males know, like, hey, it's probably time to go over and be nice to this chimpanzee, because maybe she can get pregnant. Humans, on the other hand, that's not going to be the case. Now, you think about, well, why is that? How many of you have ever seen a human baby? They're useless, right? They're worse than useless, because they're actually, they're a liability, right? They're actually just taking your resources, okay? And I don't want to say anything negative about any of you who were raised by single parents. That's phenomenal. For the most part, you need more than one person to take care of a baby, right? So what you might decide to do as a species, right, not individually, as a species, if you were to evolve a way to sort of hide your fertility, right, and then maybe you could keep that other person around, right, even though for like 24 of those 28 days nothing's going to come from whatever, you know, activities that you do, right? Only like a few of those days are you actually going to have some, you know, like result in making a child. You might do things those other days, and people might hang around longer, and then you've got that other person to help take care of other kids that you've got running around, right? And then you can kind of create some kind of partnership that way. It's kind of interesting. So there you go. Human relationships are all the result of hidden fertility and not knowing where you are in your menstrual cycle. It's kind of interesting, right? Think about that. Don't worry about this too much. These are just some other hormones fluctuate to control that cycle. Here's your body temperature. Again, body temperature does change, but it's a very small sort of shift, right? It's not a huge shift in your body temperature. There are other things, again, that you can do. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot about this. This is fun stories here. There is the refractory period in males, and this is sort of after ejaculation, where males cannot do that again for some period of time. This varies from person to person, and, you know, health and fitness, right, conditions and so forth. There are ways to bypass the refractory period, right? So in case you're interested in this, I'm just going to, even if you're not, I'm going to tell the story anyway. So it's called the Coolidge effect. And it's actually named after Calvin Coolidge. You know, that guy was a president, right? And I think if you were listing presidents to have a sexual phenomenon named after them, Calvin Coolidge would be near the bottom, right? For some reason, though, he gets this named after him. I don't, you know, when you start thinking about like who are the, you know, the sexiest presidents ever, Calvin Coolidge, I don't think makes that list. I don't even know if he's in the top 50, and we've only had 45 presidents, so I think some people get counted twice, Jacob. But The story goes that Calvin Coolidge and his wife visited a farm, which is apparently something that presidents get to do. So that's one reason for you to run. If you want to go visit a farm as president, apparently you can do that. So they were visiting this farm, and you guys know, like, chickens, right? So there was a rooster, and there are several hens. And that's how the rooster works, right? There's one rooster and, like, let's say 10 hens, right? And that one rooster will sort of take care of all 10 of those hens. That's how this situation works. So they're at this farm, and the Calvin Coolidge's wife says to the farmer, "Hey, I see a bunch of hens, but I only see one rooster. Does that one rooster just, you know, take care of all of them?" And the farmer said, "Yeah, that's absolutely how that works." And Mrs. Coolidge said, "Well, maybe you should let the president know that." I don't know. Again, I don't think Calvin Coolidge was known for his sexual virility. And then Calvin Coolidge, in his, presidential way, of course, said, "But they're all different hens, right?" And the farmer said, "Yeah, of course." And then President Coolidge said, "Well, maybe you should let Mrs. Coolidge know that they're all different hens, and that would be an important factor." So I don't think that story is actually true, but that's the story that they tell you and why they named it the Coolidge effect. But it is a true thing. So there was a group of folks, now we're ready for the Halloween story. There were a group of folks a number of years ago who wanted to test this, and they decided for whatever reason they were going to test it in sheep, right? So let's just try this in sheep. So they got a ram, that's a male sheep. They had one ram, and they would bring in a ewe, that's a female sheep. So they would bring in a ewe, and they would let the ram and the ewe copulate, right? So they did their business, they would take the ewe away. If they brought the same ewe back, the ram was not really interested, right? So the ram and the ewe just kind of, do their own thing. They weren't really interested in each other. The ram, I've already done that. I don't need to revisit that. If they brought in a different ewe, though, the ram would become excited again, and he would have sex with that second ewe, right? And so they did this, and they actually did this 12 times. They brought in 12 different ewes, and every single time the ram was ready to go. And they didn't stop because the ram was tired. They stopped because the experimenters were tired. I don't know if you've ever tried to herd 12 different sheep in and out of an experiment or not, but I can imagine it being a tiring experience. So I would have picked a smaller species, right? Just try it with rats. You can just toss one in, pull one out, take you 5 minutes. No, they decided to do these sheep. So then they thought, well, that's interesting, right? But how did the ram know, like, hey, I've already had sex with this ewe? Like, how did it know? And so then they got the bright idea. Well, let's take that ewe it's already had sex with. Let's put a mask and a trench coat on it. True story. Let's put a mask and a trench coat on this sheep and send it back in there and see if the ram knows what's going on. The ram did actually know. It's like, yeah, I've already had sex with this ewe. I realize it has a mask and a trench coat, and I guess if that ram was into role play, maybe that would be effective, but it wasn't. So that's a true story. Like, that's a published scientific paper about sheep in trench coats. We'll talk more about pheromones later, but it's likely that pheromones were what was tipping off the ram that it had already, had an experience with that particular ewe. Whether or not it had a mask and a trench coat. Think about what kind of mask do you put on a sheep, right? Was it like a Michael Myers mask? Was it like a clown mask? I don't know, right? I mean, and the trench coat. Sometimes I think about, like, if I was a really good artist, and I know you guys don't see my best work here when I draw these pictures, I think, like, I would draw cartoon strips of some of these classic studies. But I just don't know. I don't know. I'm just thinking about the sheep. I mean, it's got legs, and it's got like a sheep head, and then it's got like a mask. I don't know. I'm gonna put like a Jason mask on it, right? And then a trench coat. I mean, what's it doing with? Do you think they cinched the belt or not? I don't know, right? That's a crazy story. So anyway. That's the Coolidge effect. That's kind of an interesting thing. I would not suggest this the next time you want to bypass your refractory period right, if you're a male, and recommend adding someone else to your experience there. Get approval with the other person first, right? I'm very much about you do whatever you want to do as long as everybody involves up front about it. Jacob, did that make sense? That made sense to you, right? Okay. That's all that matters. We should talk about oxytocin briefly. How many of you love oxytocin? Like everybody should. It's sort of what makes you like other people. Especially other people with whom you have sex, right? How many of you have ever had sex with someone and then you don't have to answer this, and then afterward you're like, oh, I kind of like that person. Yeah, it wasn't really anything they did. It was just the oxytocin. That's all it was. This comes out of your pituitary gland. That's kind of interesting. It really is involved in contraction of smooth muscles, right, wherever that is. It's particularly involved in uterine contractions. So if you ever have something stuck in your uterus, like another person, and you want to get that thing out, you would want to contract your uterus as forcefully as possible. Oxytocin would help you do that. So during birth, your brain will release oxytocin and send that to your uterus, so your uterus contracts more forcefully. What's interesting, if you have twins, like a good trick to get that second one out, because you can imagine, like, if you have two babies in your uterus, all right, and that's really going to stretch that uterus, and you get one out, and you're like, well, this isn't so bad. I could probably live with this smaller baby, like, still stuck in there, right? Like, half of the problem's gone. We don't really need to invest in pushing this thing out again. Just leave it in there and it'll be okay, right? That's what your uterus is thinking. What they will often do is take the first child that's born and let you start nursing that child, because that will sort of increase the release of oxytocin, which will then help your uterus contract and expel the second child. So there you go. There's a good trick for you. Hey, who loves voles? I got one more oxytocin story for you. Voles are these little rodents, right? And there are different species of voles. There's one species of vole that is very promiscuous, right? So these guys, if you were to reach your hand into a vole hole, they live in holes, by the way, and you were to pull out that family that's in there, and you were to give a DNA test to the father and the vole pups, they may or may not be related, right? Because the male vole will just kind of go, you know, on a circuit and visit all of the vole holes where the females are living, and just move on from one to the other. There's another species of vole, if you reach in and you grab the male and the pups, they're going to be related, right? Vast majority of the time. Those are monogamous voles. They're going to hang out for a long time. They're going to make these long-lasting pair bonds. The real difference in these guys is oxytocin, right? Those monogamous voles have a high level of oxytocin, whereas the promiscuous voles have low levels of oxytocin. So there you go. If you're really interested in someone's fidelity, you want to have a good predictor for that, you could test their oxytocin levels. See if they're high or they're low. Now the downside to this is as oxytocin levels go up, sex drive goes down, right? And so what you really need to do is you find that happy medium, right? Between your recreational activities and your relationship fidelity. And that's going to be different for every person, but you can find where that is and make your best judgment. It's pretty cool, right? So much of what you think you do is you, but so much of what you actually do is just a bunch of hormones. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be punished or rewarded for your behavior. It just means you're not in control of it as much as you think. It's a little frightening, isn't it? But on the other hand, it can be very liberating, because when somebody does something irritating to me, I just think, it's not really them. It's just a bunch of chemicals in their brain making them do things that bother me. Right, we already talked about the Coolidge effect. Here's male sexual behavior. I think you guys pretty much know what's going on in those four steps. If you don't, again, there's probably a video on YouTube or one of those other video streaming services you're not allowed to access on the university's internet that could show you those things. In females, though, we should talk about something cool called lordosis. Now, this is particularly true in rodents. Okay. In rodents, when females are receptive to another or to a like a sexual encounter, they'll do a series of behaviors to sort of attract the attention of the other male. One thing they'll do is they'll sort of arch their back, and they'll kind of put their hind end up in the air. They'll move their tail out of the way. Now, all of these sort of make sense, right? If you know much about like rat anatomy and where all the pieces are, sort of lifting up the back end and moving the tail out of the way, that's just easy access. But the next thing they do is really sort of weird. They start wiggling their ears. And apparently, if a female mouse wiggles its ears, it will drive a male mouse crazy. I don't know. Try that the next time if you're trying to, like, you know, pick up somebody at a bar. Come up to them and just start wiggling your ears. Guaranteed to be an interesting evening. Because if they find that attractive, hold on, that's going to be weird. And if they don't, you know, you might get a, you know, glass of water thrown in your face or something, right? I don't know. Nobody's going to try that, are they? Now what you should do is, though, you should do this observational study. You should go, like, I don't know where you guys meet people, and I don't really care. We should go wherever that is, right? And you should, like, sit in the back and try to, like, watch people's ears and see if they wiggle, or, like, maybe they flare their noses. I don't know, right? There's probably some human behavior that people do to signal that they're receptive to a sexual encounter. I don't think it involves ears, but it might. Here's a comparison of the human menstrual cycle and a rat estrous cycle. Again, the end result's sort of the same. The hormones fluctuate in different ways. There's some different steps, but nothing to worry about. Let's think about this a minute. Okay. I don't want to forget to tell you, I've got two great stories. One about gorilla testicles, which is going to be exciting, and another about sea lions. You guys like elephant seals. I'm sorry, elephant seals. You guys like elephant seals. Earlier I said it was important to think about organizational and activational effects of hormones, right? And that effect later on behavior. And so there have been a number of studies where folks have, in rodents, because we're not allowed to do this in people, they will expose rodents to androgens or estrogens at different time points, right? Either early in development, later in development, and they'll see what happens with their sexual behavior, right? Which is sort of interesting. So what they will do is, for example, in this case, immediately after birth, these rodents were not exposed to any hormones at all. Later, they were given either testosterone or estrogens. That's estradiol and progesterone. If they were female, and they were in this category where later in life they were exposed to estrogens, they would start exhibiting female sexual behavior. None of the other categories or none of the other examples there would exhibit any sort of sexual behavior. On the other hand, what's really interesting, if they were given testosterone immediately after birth, later if they were exposed to testosterone and they were males, then they would exhibit male sexual behavior. If they were females, they would not. And even if the females were exposed to estrogens as adults, they would not exhibit female sexual behavior if they'd been exposed to testosterone early on. Okay? And this is because of those organizational effects of testosterone. Testosterone can have these subtle effects on brain structure, on future hormone release and activation that will cause different behaviors in these rodents. It's really kind of fascinating. We'll talk a good bit about this later, but there's sort of natural experiments for this. I'm going to do my best here to draw a rat uterus. A rat uterus has two horns, right? The human uterus only has one horn, just in case you were curious. And what you can put in this rat uterus are males and female fetuses, right? Which is kind of interesting. Let's say we put them in there in this kind of combination, right? And we can look at the females, and what we can do is we label these females by how many males are surrounding them, right? So if you look at this particular female here, she's a 0M female, right? Because there were no males around her. This is a 1M female, and this female over here is a 2M female because there are 2 males. Obviously, there is some testosterone coming off of these guys, right? Kind of diffuses over. Depending on the, how many males you have next to you, will determine how much testosterone you're exposed to in the uterus, right? For these rodents. They've done this, I think, in rats, mice, maybe even guinea pigs and gerbils. It all seems to be the same story. What's interesting, when you plot this out, and you have your 0M going to your 1M, going to your 2M, what you see is the 0M are the least aggressive, and the 2M females are the most aggressive, right? You also see an increase in the likelihood that these 2M females will actually try to participate in male sexual behavior, right, with other females, which is kind of interesting. As adults, the 2M females breed less often with the males. The males try to breed with them less, and they have fewer offspring throughout their lifetime as well, as compared to the 0M or the 1M females. That's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of a cool story. When it comes to humans, right, like who cares about rats? We want to know if this is true with humans. Well, most of you did not share a uterus with somebody else, right? You were in there by yourself. You had the whole place to you. You could kind of spread out a little bit, hang some things on the wall, decorate as you wanted to. The only time when we could test this in humans would be fraternal twins, when you would have a male and a female, right? And that happens from time to time. Now, what you do see in fraternal twins with a male and female, you do see a slight increase in aggressive behavior in the females if they shared a uterus with their brother, and there's also a slight increase in the likelihood that they would identify as a lesbian compared to the average population, which is kind of fascinating. There is also something called CAH. I don't know if you guys have heard of CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, right? This is when your adrenal glands are just dumping out hormones all the time. Not too big of a deal if you're a male, but if you're a female, this can actually mimic sort of being one of these 2M females, right? And what we see with individuals who have CAH is also an increase in aggressive behavior. Later we'll talk more about testosterone, its influence on aggression, but also, again, that slight increase in the likelihood to identify as homosexual over heterosexual for females. All right. This is kind of an interesting graph. This was a study that was done in heterosexual couples that was, with males and females, and what they were trying to see is if females initiated sexual activities at a different rate during different times of their menstrual cycle, right? And so what you might predict is if the point of all of this is to create, offspring, then you might see an uptick in female-initiated sexual behavior or female-initiated sex during that ovulatory period, right? And interestingly, this is what they found. So that's kind of cool. There are some interesting problems with this particular study, though. All of these studies were done in long-term monogamous relationships, stable relationships, right? They weren't all necessarily, married couples, but they had been together for a long period of time. Now, if you think about this for a moment, obviously, if you've been with someone for an extended period of time, you're probably going to feel more confident that if there is, a child that's created based on your sexual activity, that other person will stay around and help you take care of it, right? Okay, because you have that kind of long-term committed relationship and you're kind of buying into this. What's interesting is you see sort of an opposite effect if you look at females who are not in committed relationships. There's actually a decrease in sexual behavior during that ovulatory period for females who are not in a committed relationship. Because again, you can think about the risks involved with having a child with someone who's not reliable. Having sex with someone not reliable out here is not really a big deal, right? Because you're not going to get a kid out of that. Having sex with someone unreliable during that ovulatory period, that can have some major, lifelong consequences. So I don't know. That's kind of interesting, right? Now I'm thinking, like, if you want to try to figure out if you were in a really, like, you felt like you were in a stable relationship or not, like track how many times you try to have sex and then try to match that up to your menstrual cycle. Like if you're really trying to debate whether or not you should commit more to someone. No, nobody's thinking about that. I was. It was like a really objective way to test the quality of your relationship. Keep you from making bad decisions, right? If you notice like the same time every month right around here, you're like, I'm not having sex with that guy. Then you probably don't think he's that reliable. Right? There's something to think about. And what about testosterone in women and their, sort of sex drive, right? That's kind of interesting. How many of you have ever been in a long-distance relationship, or you know someone who's been in a long-distance relationship, right? Yeah, what's one of the first things you do when you get back? Yeah, right? I see some of you responding to that. What's one of the first things you do when you get back together if you've been apart for a few weeks? Right? Sometimes you don't even make it out of the airport parking lot, which, believe me, the TSA will get after you for that. I've seen it on TV. What's interesting is if you look at females' testosterone levels, baseline's going to be pretty low. They did this study in folks who were in long-distance relationships. Massive increase in testosterone the day before they were going to meet with their partner. After visiting with their partner, there's, decrease back toward baseline. I will let you figure out what happened in between those two times. But I think it's pretty obvious, right? It's kind of interesting. Similar pattern in males. Obviously, the fluctuations are not going to be as massive, given that the baseline for males is going to be a bit higher. But there was a study that was published anonymously back in I believe it was back in the 60s, maybe. A guy was on a research island, and so he would shave every day, and he would, because there's nothing else you can do. If you're stuck on an island in the 1960s, what you do every day is you shave, and then you weigh the clippings, right? I mean, why not, right? I mean, that makes sense. So he weighed his beard clippings every day, right? Which is kind of interesting. What he noticed is there was an increase in the weight of the beard clippings as he got closer to being able to go back to the mainland. And you can imagine what was back on the mainland, right? May or may not have been someone he was committed to, but there was someone who was willing to participate in certain sexual activities with him, and that would increase beard growth because that's related. Rate of beard growth and testosterone are related. So, kind of an interesting story. So there you go. So now if any of you are thinking about I'm going to track my testosterone levels, shave every day and just weigh, I don't know what kind of scale you have to, right? I mean, because that's pretty sensitive to measure there's 3 more beard clippings today. I don't know. Questions about that? That was kind of an interesting story. I'm trying to think if now's a good time to tell you about pinnipeds. Probably is. As we're talking about relationships and so forth, before we get much into the other stuff. So, how many of you have ever wondered why most humans only pair up with one other human at a time? Right? That's typically how it goes. That's how it's been with our species for a long period of time. That's not how it is with a lot of other species, right? In particular, pinnipeds. These are things like seals, sea lions, any of those mammals that have flippers, right? And they use them to walk around and or swim. Right? We're not talking about like whales and stuff, but we're talking about other things. These animals typically have a harem situation, where you will have one, it's particularly true with elephant seals, you will have one male and you will have multiple females, right? What's interesting about this is it's about body size. And so if you were to plot these pinnipeds, it's really interesting. And if you were to make this like difference in body size between males and females, right? So if you were to say, well, if the difference is the same, you know, if they're the same size or if they're a lot different, right? And then down here you want to plot harem size from like 1 to many. What you would see is a pretty tight correlation. The bigger the male is relative to the female, the more females he has in his harem, right? And so if you apply this to humans, on average, human males are not that much bigger than human females to justify adding a whole other person to the relationship. You could probably get by with like 2/10 of a person, but that's really hard to negotiate. So there you go. It's kind of fascinating, right? Gorillas are a similar story, right? Gorillas have a harem. Male gorillas are much larger than female gorillas, right? So we would anticipate that we would see that, you know, one to many sort of relationship, which is kind of fascinating. Interesting thing about gorillas, they have extremely small testicles. I don't know if anybody finds that interesting other than me. Taylor, you... Sure, right? The reason they have really small testicles, even though they have multiple females in their harem, they probably only have sex once every 3 or 4 months, right? So they don't have sex that often, even though there are many sort of females available. So you don't really need large testicles if you're only going to have sex, you know, 3 or 4 times a year, right? On the other end of that spectrum, if we're thinking about the great apes, are the bonobos, and bonobos are fascinating. Originally, they were described as pygmy chimpanzees. They actually are slightly smaller than chimpanzees, but they're completely different too. They even look different. They're not as hairy. They're hairier than people, but still not as hairy as a chimpanzee. These guys have giant testicles. They have the largest testicles of any of the primates, even though their body size isn't the biggest. The reason for that is bonobos have sex like every 38 seconds. And they are, you know, like out in a field and there's like a bonobo and he sees another bonobo and they're like, hey, we should probably have sex. Unfortunately, there's another bonobo that gets in the way in between, so he's got to stop and have sex with that bonobo on the way over. So they have sex many, many, many times a day. The sex doesn't last very long. It's very short-lived, but they have giant testicles because they're constantly having to, you know, produce sperm for that, which is kind of fascinating. Bonobos are vegetarians. They're a little nicer than chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are kind of aggressive, but chimpanzees have giant testicles too. Humans are somewhere in the middle on that, right? I think most humans probably hope to have sex more than 3 times a year, but less than every 38 seconds, right? There are other things you have to do, like brush your teeth. Bonobos don't have to worry about brushing their teeth, so they can have sex more often. Although penis size is a slightly different story. If you're thinking about that, bonobos actually have quite small penises. Humans, on the other hand, have the largest penis of any primate, which is kind of interesting. A lot of folks said that's probably because humans have acrobatic sex, and you could think about that if you wanted. It's probably not, I mean, I'm not saying it's not true that people have acrobatic sex. You probably don't need a large penis for that. And the caveat to this is orangutans, right? These guys have sex for 14 hours at a time hanging in trees, right? And I'm imagining that's fairly acrobatic, right? I mean, hanging in a tree having sex for 14 hours seems like something falls in the acrobatic category. But yet humans have larger penises. So there you go. I don't know if anybody thought that was an interesting story. How many of you are thinking about orangutans having sex right now? Nobody's going to admit to that. This is the time when you call your grandma after class and you don't tell her what we talked about in class, right? What did you talk about in class today? But it's important stuff to think about, because I don't think you realize like how much this actually influences your day-to-day life, right? And the structure of society in general, right? Just think about it. I mean, we talked about marriage earlier, and it's typically a one-to-one relationship. What if it was the other way around? What if females were 3 times as large as males? Then like one woman would marry 3 males, right? And that would be the way our laws were written, because biologically that's what makes sense. Yeah. It's a whole different world, right? There you go. Other questions about gorilla private parts? Happy to answer any of those you have. No, nobody's going to ask those. We should talk briefly about pheromones. How many of you have ever purchased pheromones? You don't have to answer that because it was a waste of your money. But you can buy these pheromones, right? And try to spray them on yourself, make yourself more attractive to other people. I will tell you something which you probably should have done, is saved that money and invested it, because a large bank account will make you more attractive. There's an interesting way that works. And I don't mean it in a shallow way, right, Taylor? I don't mean it at all in a shallow way. But it's all about stability and resources and providing those resources, right? And if somebody's not able to do that, then they're not going to really be worth your time in the long-term sense, right? But pheromones are chemicals released by one animal. They're detected by another animal. They do have an effect on that animal's behavior and physiology, which is kind of interesting. Most of these are going to be detected by the vomeronasal organ. You have a vomeronasal organ. It's not really connected to anything in your brain, so it's not doing much. Anything that is coming through that's for humans for pheromones is going to be through the olfactory bulb and so forth. There are a number of studies that you probably know about where people wear T-shirts for a couple days and they have women smell them and then rate how attractive they think the person is based on the smell of the T-shirt. And sometimes that'll match up with how they rate the faces on attractiveness. I don't know, right? But that evidence is not overwhelming that humans are actually that great at detecting pheromones, or that the pheromones actually have a big influence on their behavior. There are, however, a few interesting examples in animals where pheromones can have an effect on the behavior. There's the Lee-Boot effect, right? This is if you put a bunch of rodents together and they're only females, they'll actually stop their estrous cycle. That's kind of interesting, right? If there's not a male present, there's really no reason to go through your estrous cycle, right? It's just a waste of energy. If there's not any chance at all that you're going to become impregnated. So if they're not smelling the male, then the females will stop. You can expose these females to male urine, and then they will start that estrous cycle again, right? So you just like spray them with male mouse urine. That works. The Witten effect is sort of the opposite of that. So once you've stopped it, you can start it again with that male urine. There's the Vandenberg effect. This is when you can accelerate the onset of puberty if females are exposed to male urine or the odor of a male. Again, those pheromones, you can kick them into puberty, which is kind of interesting. The fourth effect here is the Bruce effect, which is when if there is a pregnant female mouse, she will actually abort that pregnancy spontaneously if you expose her to the urine of a new male mouse. And that makes a lot of sense if you're a mouse. Mice are territorial. If you were impregnated by the previously dominant male mouse in that territory, it's probably not going to be a good idea to continue to carry his pups. One, he's probably dead now, because if there's a new male mouse around, that's what happens. The new male mouse is not going to be interested in taking care of those pups that are not his, right? Nobody wants to raise somebody else's kids. And then, secondly, the new male mouse is probably better than the old one if he was able to kill the old one, right, and displace him. So why wouldn't you want to have that guy's pups? So it makes a whole lot of sense to just get rid of those. This does not happen in people, so don't worry. Like if you accidentally walk into the wrong, restroom at the gas station and you smell some male urine, okay, so you don't have to worry. I mean, it's going to be nasty, right? But you don't have to worry about any problems like that. Gorillas will actually also kill infants. So if a new male gorilla comes into a new territory and takes over, he will go and kill any of the nursing infants. That one prevents him from having to take care of kids who aren't his, and two, any of those females who were nursing, it'll kick them over, to restart their estrous cycle so that he can impregnate them and have infants that are his. That's kind of interesting, right? So there you go. We have laws against that in people, but I imagine it'd be something similar if you could. Nobody thinks about that, right? Again, it's all about that hidden menstrual cycle and hidden fertility, because you don't know. There's always some question. So now's when I should tell them they don't know who their father is. There's always some question about, like, is that person your father? You definitely know it's your mother, right? Because you flew right out of there. And when I say flew, I mean you came out screaming and clawing and scratching and kicking and painfully stretching things. Wasn't a smooth process. But the male's like, well, maybe. You never know. There's some estimates that as many as like as high as 25% of people are actually the result of extra-pair copulations or extramarital affairs, and they don't know that. Now that's the high estimate, but it's probably around 10 or 15%, which is still reasonable, right? So some people are trying to think, like, do I actually look like that guy? And then some of you are maybe rejoicing, and then some of you are maybe having an existential crisis, and then that's okay. Hang in there.
If you run your DNA through ancestry, it'll tell you if your dad's actually your dad, because my dad had already done it and then I did it, and we had elected to like show other family members, and it came as my dad.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. I wondered where that story was going, but I'm glad that's where it went. That's a positive one. 'Cause I was like, and then we found out, and now my mom lives somewhere else. No, I just, because that story could have gone two ways. I'm glad it went that way. Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting, right?
So if you want to find out without telling your dad that you have doubts, you can order him that test and be like, Happy Merry Christmas, and then you take it and then find out.
Well, that's interesting. There you go. Good luck with that, folks. The problem is, if he has a brother, I wonder how that, then it's probably, you may not know. See, now I've put some doubt in your head. I apologize. You don't know if your dad has a brother or not. 'Cause you may still know.
Well, he has a brother, but they have different dads. So
Oh, there you go. You're okay then. You're okay. Still a happy ending. But if they had the same father, then you could see where, if they're using that, I don't know, maybe they're using a different system. Because you can do other things too, right? You can look at other DNA besides the Y. I mean, they're not looking at your Y chromosome anyway, because you don't have one. So, there you go. Fun stuff. What was I going to tell them, Jake? I thought I had I'm not sure either. Oh, birds. Hey, I should tell you about birds. How many of you think birds mate for life? They don't. I hate to really ruin that for you. People always thought right, Taylor? You always hear this, like, birds mate for life. Birds don't mate for life. Birds just live in the same nest for a long period of time. But you know one thing birds can do? They can fly to other nests. And you know what they can do when they're at that other nest? Same thing they were doing at their own nest. Right? And so what will happen is, like a bird, the male bird will try to go over to another bird's nest while that bird is somewhere else. These birds, though they're bird brains, they're not too bright, they don't realize that while he is visiting someone else is visiting his own nest, right? And so there are a high number of birds that have eggs that are not their own, like the fathers are not their own. And we can figure this out through DNA testing now, right? So they'll DNA test the bird chicks and the father, and quite often they don't match, which is kind of interesting. You want to hear another chicken story, though? This is a good one. So chickens, remember how I said there's one rooster and 10 hens, right? And so what chickens will do, the roosters will try to protect those hens, And so they have a special call that they yell out if there's a hawk coming, right? Because the hawk will come down and like eat the chickens, okay? And so that rooster will yell this call, and all the hens know it's time to hide. And the rooster has to hide somewhere, right? Sometimes neighboring roosters will come over, and this is a great one, Rodney. They'll come over and make that bird that, like, hey, there's a hawk call, and then that rooster will run off and hide somewhere. He can't hide with all 10 of those hens at once. So you know what, like 8 of those hens are doing? They're right there for you. And so that other rooster will try to get in with one of those other hens while he's tricking the guy with a false alarm. It's brilliant. It's like the smartest thing a chicken can do. I mean, chickens aren't that bright. I mean, they can't even fly. They can just kind of fall slowly. Chickens. Did I ever tell you about the time I lost in a match at tic-tac-toe to a chicken? Yeah, that happened. He was in this machine, and you put a quarter in, and you could play tic-tac-toe with this chicken, and if you won, you got a little prize. So you had to, like, pick. I ended up losing. Don't worry about that. We should talk about brain mechanisms, right? And brains are different in males and females. Okay? It's not too surprising. Because males and females do different things behaviorally. We've kind of talked about this, right? Especially in rats, we talked about, the male sexual behavior and the female sexual behavior. 2 different kinds of behavior, so probably different brain things going on. For males, you have something called the medial preoptic area and the sexually dimorphic nucleus. Both of these guys are highly involved in male sexual behavior in rats. See something similar in humans. In females, you have the ventral medial hypothalamus, right? And that's going to be essential in female sexual behavior. Now, you're probably going to ask the question, like, how do we know this? Well, in rats, it's easy. What you can do in a rat is you can destroy parts of its brain and see if it can still do those things, right? So if you were to destroy the ventral medial nucleus of the hypothalamus or that medial preoptic area, right, whatever, and then you don't see those sexual behaviors, that's fine. Now, in humans, on the other hand, it gets a little trickier, right? There aren't a lot of people signing up say, like, you can kill that brain nucleus that is actually responsible for my sexual behavior. That's fine. Let's see what happens. So instead, we have to do, like, fMRI studies, right? And so now you're thinking about, how am I getting 2 people in an fMRI? And typically, you have to lie still in an fMRI, right? Anybody ever had an MRI? They don't let you move around in there, do they?
I had one where I couldn't even swallow.
Yeah. I know, right? So.
You don't really think about swallowing until you can't.
Yeah. So now imagine that we're going to try to do a study about which parts of your brain are active during sexual activities. And we're going to put you in an MRI machine. But you're not going to be allowed to do, well, any of the things that you would normally do, right? During one of those things. Your only job is going to be to lie still. So there's really only one option that you've got at that point, right? And you've got to bring a buddy to help you out. And so this was sort of a 2-person study where one person was at least partially in the MRI machine, and at least the bottom half of you was hanging out. And you had to bring your own person to help you, with the other end of that. And they did males and females this way. I'm assuming there was a curtain so they couldn't see what you were doing, but I think you had to tell them what you were doing when you were finished. And then they would scan your brain while you were in there, right? And I'm just thinking, that's interesting, because then we know exactly what brain regions are active during these different responses, right? The problem is, how do you advertise for that? I mean, because I think, like, if I saw an advertisement that said, hey, you want to bring a date to the fMRI machine, I don't know. I don't know who's signing up for that. It's just a weird one. Yeah. I don't know how they got it past the IRB. That's an interesting one, though, right? So there you go. We don't do studies like that here, just in case any of you want to, anybody's got like a medical equipment fetish or something. Too bad. Jacob, this is always the lecture where you either get people who ask you really interesting questions or people who are too embarrassed to leave. Because I think a number of people would really like to leave. You have to be here. It's your job. So, too bad. I should make, next year I think I'm going to make them write a paper on the ethics of fMRI sex studies. We could do a seminar. That'd be interesting. Well, we could talk about paternal behavior in just a moment. What's really interesting is only about 5% of mammals, like mammalian species, actually form long-lasting, monogamous bonds. Just kind of makes us an oddball, right? That we're one of those 5% of the species that tend to do that. On the average, right? I mean, again, there are all kinds of variability, in sexual behavior in other species too, not just humans. Bonobos are notorious for their sort of freewheeling attitude towards sex. They're one of the other species other than humans where you see, a significant amount of heterosexual and homosexual sexual activity, right? You see that quite a bit in bonobos, actually, compared to a lot of other species, which is interesting. We could talk about these things, but I don't know that we need to. We already talked about all of this, which is awesome. I'm not going to ask you about the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, which is interesting. We could talk briefly about sexual orientation. We're going to spend a lot of time on this. They're interesting genetic factors. You guys heard about this guy, Dean Hamer? Dean Hamer's been a guy who's been in... He gets himself in a little bit of trouble once in a while with the mainstream media folks. So the first time he said, "Hey, I figured out which genes make you gay," and so a lot of people weren't too happy about that. And then he came out the other time and he said, "Hey, I found which genes make you believe in God." Or even less people happy about that. And so he was just double whammy. Not terribly popular outside of certain circles. However, when it comes to DNA, man, stuff's easy, right? So you've either got 0, 1, or 2 copies of this allele, and then you just have to map that onto your behavior, right? And then you just look for trends. It's that simple. So I wrote this really interesting book called The God Gene, and the book is really only this long. For any of you who are psych majors, I highly recommend this book. And the reason I recommend it is the DNA part of it is 3 pages. He's like, yeah, we took some cheek swabs, and we found people had 0, 1, or 2 copies of this allele, right? That's easy, right? That's DNA studies. That's how they work, right? It's super easy. The other part of the book, all of it, he spent describing how he defined whether or not you were religious, which is difficult, right? Because he had to be able to find something that went across specific types of religions, right? And so what if you're a Buddhist, or if you're Jewish, or if you're Hindu? I mean, how do you find the common factors there? And it's actually really neat to see how he operationally defined that really sort of complex phenomenon, which is really interesting. And then he just said, here's the DNA and here's how that matches. So it's just kind of cool. So there's that. We already talked about hormones, and then there's some prenatal environment effects as well. It seems like if you're a male and you have a number of older brothers, you are slightly more likely to identify as homosexual than if you didn't have older brothers. I think Dean Hamer was in on that finding as well. But I would recommend The God Gene. It's an easy read. I think it is. You wouldn't think of it as a great book for psychologists, but for those of you who are trying to operationally define any sort of variable, right, and how complicated that can be, I think on a face value you might think, well, I definitely, how are you going to determine if someone is a sports fan, right? So, well, that's easy, right? I mean, do you have an airbrushed license plate for the Steelers? Well, then you're a sports fan, right? And you can but how are you going to objectively measure that? It becomes difficult. Questions about that? Comments, concerns? No. Nobody's going to ask any questions. I get one of 2 things: no questions, or somebody will always ask, my cousin had twins and there were 2 different fathers. Can you tell me how that happened? And I always say she keeps a tight calendar. There's no other way to make that happen. Okay, good. Finally, people are warming up a little bit.
You know that lead boot effect we
Yeah.
talked about earlier?
Yeah.
The estrous cycles of the rats, they just stopped, and
Yeah,
that
I don't typically think about nuns. Um, I don't know why I don't typically think about nuns. Taylor thought that was funny for some reason. Do you think about nuns?
sometimes?
So I will tell you this: the only time I ever thought about nuns is, well, 2 times. One, my mom said the funniest thing she ever saw was when a nun slipped and fell in the snow, uh, which is really funny because a number of you are laughing at that. The second time was my wife and I looked at a house over behind St. Mary's, and there was an easement so the nuns could walk through the yard of that house. So they could walk from there, like they have like a nun house. I don't know what I don't know that it's I guess it's a convent, right? I always think about convents like up in the hills and somewhere in Europe, right? They could walk from there over to the hospital. And so we didn't buy that house. I just thought that would have been weird, especially for me, to have had these nuns like walking through my yard. And I could have invited my mom over in the winter, right? We could have really bonded over some nun slippage. Is that what you call that? So I think, one, you have to make sure they're young nuns, because old nuns aren't going to be having a menstrual cycle anyway, right? Because they're past menopause.
Would they go through menopause earlier than like somebody who's out in the community?
That's a possibility.
I'm intrigued now.
Well, you know what? There's a place where you can go and you can ask, and you could do this. I feel like, though, the nuns aren't going to be really open to this. That's my feeling on it. But I think it would happen. And I think some of these other things, like the opposite, not the Vandenberg effect, but if you think about like an all-female boarding school or something, right? And so I think that would delay the onset of puberty for those if there weren't any males.
Are
Right?
you allowed to study that in people? Like, is that ethical?
Yeah, I don't see why not. Now, you can't go around and just, like, spraying people with urine. But that's probably not ethical. I mean, maybe if you ask, if you get informed consent. Right? Yeah. I mean, I think about the things doctors do to you, right? I mean, they poke and prod and dig around, right? I think you could do this. I do think it would be difficult because you would have to you'd have to find a population that's really, really isolated, right? And they would have to be like in that between puberty and menopause age. On top of that, like I couldn't do that study, but you could, right? And the reason I couldn't is because then if a male were to go in, they could just completely skew the results, right? And this is actually true. This is actually an important thing even in rodent studies. You have to be careful because some of the pheromones are going to be similar. So if I were going to conduct any of these studies, I would make sure all of the people doing them were females. Because if any males actually participated in handling the rodents, I would feel like that could be a confounding issue. You guys don't think about those things, do you? That's why I'm on this side of the podium.
Couldn't being in a high stress environment trigger those same reactions? Because if you place a child, like if you place a young female in a high stress environment, she will go through puberty faster.
Yeah.
Than a child. So don't you think in rodents, them being put in small boxes and watched and manipulated in such ways would trigger their bodies to go through the same type of thing?
Yes. However, if you're comparing, you always have control groups. The control group's going to go through the exact same situation, except they're not going to get the odor of the male, right? And so if you still see they all might have an earlier onset than a group of natural mice, but you would still have an even earlier onset with the ones exposed to the male urine. But that's a good question. That's why you need control groups. So you would have to go.
I would need 2 nun groups.
That's a lot of nuns. But it's a good study. You should design that. You could publish in the Journal of Nunnery. I don't know. Is Is there a journal?
Do you need a normal control group, like a normal group of women in an age group?
You would, yeah. Yeah, you don't necessarily need 2 nun groups. They don't make like co-ed nunneries, do they?
No, but when they have like a priest, maybe in some of the levels.
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
I don't think they let those priests go out as much anymore. I think they're clamping down on that. They should have started decades ago, but you know, better late than never, I guess. Just a tad late. Yeah. No offense to anybody in here who's a priest. Nobody's a priest, I think, right? I would know. You'd have the collar. That's how you know the priests. I had so many more jokes I could have done right there, too. And I'm just not going to. It's just not fair. Alright, so that's much more than I anticipated talking about nuns and or priests. But they were good questions, all the same. I wonder if anybody tracks that. I mean, that is interesting, right? I mean, when do you go, I don't know anything, I'll tell you. I know little about nuns, and that's more than I really cared to know. When do you become a nun? Anybody know? Like, how young can you become a nun? Because I feel like at 10, you can't sign up to be a nun. But can you? You have to be 18 to be a nun?
I think you have to be 18 because you have to be able to legally consent and vote in your life.
Oh.
And your parents may start you in like a Catholic school or something at a younger age, but you probably don't devote your life to.
Huh.
Yeah.
Did you say nun inbreeding? In grooming. Nun in grooming. Okay. I was thinking the nuns aren't breeding.
But you'd have to trust that they're not behaviors and not you're asking for like,
I feel like they probably given him an exam. Right?
You can become a nun after you had sex, though, right? Yeah, you can.
There was that nun on house who had that like copper allergy, and she had that IUD, and like they couldn't figure out what was killing her because she actually used to, I think, be a prostitute. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Well, there you go. Being a nun's not out for everybody then. I mean, it's out for some of us, but I guess the priesthood's still open. I don't know how that works. All right, let's talk about parental behavior. What do we want to say about maternal behavior? Maternal behavior is kind of interesting. Mothers will make brood nests. These are nests for your brood, right? So the mother rodents will make a nest for the mother, for the child, yeah, their pups, their offspring. Most of what we think about when we study behavior is maternal behavior. We don't think about paternal behavior as much. Not all species have the males involved in care of the offspring. For mammals, though, the mother has to take care, at least for some period of time, because of the milk production and feeding, right? And so you're kind of tied to that for a while. Oh, I guess I should talk about spatial. Just for a moment, we should talk about spatial abilities. There are very, very few differences in sort of neurological performance between males and females. There's sort of two interesting differences. One is in odor identification. We talked about that. Females are typically better at odor identification than males. And there are a couple reasons that might happen. On the flip side, males tend to be slightly better at spatial tasks than females. Now there's some real detailed caveats to this, but we can just kind of go with that particular example and be safe. The reason for this is, in mammals at least, all mammals, female mammals, are tied for an extended period of time to their offspring, right? Because they are providing the food for that group of offspring, so they have to be sort of in one location because the offspring are not mobile, so they're going to be staying there. The males in those species are going to be able to travel out pick up resources and come back, right? And so what we've seen is that not just in humans, but in every mammal species that has been tested, the males perform slightly better on spatial tasks than the females do, which is really sort of an interesting example that you see this in rats and monkeys and I think even woodchucks maybe. They tested this as well as humans. And that's because the females, again, in mammals are going to be tied to the offspring for some period of time, which is kind of interesting. The other thing we should think about is for maternal behavior, there are a set of nuclei that get activated. The ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. What's interesting about this is the same brain circuit that gets activated when you take cocaine or you do anything that's actually addictive, right? Anything you do that's rewarding, that feels good, that you should do again, that particular brain region gets activated, right? It's involved in the rewarding aspects of a behavior. Now, if you see this is a mouse and she's carrying her pup, what's really interesting about this is mouse and rat pups, they taste bad right after they're born. I don't know if any of you have ever put a rat pup that's just come out of a rat uterus into your mouth. I've not. We think it tastes bad for a couple of reasons. One, you can just imagine it would taste bad. And two, the mice or the rat mothers will make nasty, like repulsive faces whenever they're like cleaning off because they have to clean off the pups, right? And they're like the whole time. It's really this kind of gross thing going on. So that's kind of interesting. Now, how do they overcome this? They overcome that by activating that ventral tegmental to nucleus accumbens, right? So it becomes active, it becomes rewarding, and this is why I always say your mothers don't love you, they're just addicted to taking care of you. And so every time they do something to take care of you, that same brain region gets active as if they were taking methamphetamine. So there you go. That might explain a lot of your mother's behavior, right, Rosie? I mean, now you're thinking like, now I get it. You know, when you're gone, she goes through a little bit of withdrawal, right? It all makes sense now. Mothers, what are you going to do with them? Everybody's got one. I don't know, any questions about that? That's kind of interesting. I thought it was an interesting story, at least. And there it is. Ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine's released there during maternal behavior. Which I think is kind of an interesting aspect. Because maternal behavior seems like it would be unpleasant to do, right? How many of you think it would be great to like wipe human waste off of another person? Doesn't sound like fun, does it? To carry around another person and all of their luggage for years doesn't sound like fun. Get somebody else dressed every day. Some of you, I can tell, don't even like getting yourselves dressed. So I can imagine you trying to dress someone else. You're going to be dressing them in sacks. You know, it's like put a little string at the top, tie it up, leave their head poking out. Sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Put a couple straps on that bag and you just carry that kid anywhere you want to go. So, because maternal behavior is not something that's easy to do, we need to make it rewarding so that mothers will do that. And we do that by activating the ventral tegmental to nucleus accumbens pathway. Anybody have any questions? Finished that a bit sooner than I anticipated. I think I covered everything. Yeah. Questions, comments, concerns?
It's kind of a dumb question, but if you say you wanted to be a mother, but you weren't ready in your life, could you maybe like treat yourself with amphetamines that would like bind to the same receptors and like you wouldn't want to be a parent anymore?
I'd just get a dog. I'd stay off the amphetamine if you can. I mean, I know it's not possible for everybody. I mean, it just happens, right? There are other brain circuits that are, that's only a small component of all of the circuit that's involved in maternal behavior, and just taking a drug's not going to satisfy all of that. So I mean, man, that's a tough call, right? Would I rather you have kids or do drugs? Is there a third option? I guess it depends on the drug. But if it's one that's, there are like certain drugs I'd say you could probably try that and you'll be fine. Like the amphetamines I would stay away from. Those are pretty serious. A lot of side effects. You have to worry about like stroke, heart attack, things like that. If you said, hey, I'm going to try LSD instead, I might say, okay, you can do that. The side effect profile for LSD is pretty mild, so you'd probably be okay. And there's like no risk of overdose, which is awesome. Right, you could definitely overdose on other drugs. So I'd watch out for that. Other questions? Comments? Concerns?